Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Sunday Night History Chat. My name is Michael C. Hardy. Welcome to my library. We are hanging out here in Western North Carolina. It is cold and a little snowy out there this evening. It is January 28th, 2024, and it's still dark this time of year. But I hope everyone is doing really, really well out there, wherever it is that you watch from. I know we've got folks from all over the United States, from Arizona and Virginia, and here in North Carolina and Florida, and occasionally even a friend from Australia. So if you want to drop a note into the box this evening, let us know where you're watching from. I hope everybody is doing really good. Miss Elizabeth is sitting over here to my right, your left, and she is there to keep us all in line this evening. Maybe we won't get too far out of bounds. Great week last week. I was off speaking. Unusual for me to go out and speak this time of year, but I was out speaking in Kingsport, Tennessee, and in Asheville, North Carolina this past weekend. I don't have, best I can recall, anything else coming up for the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'm going to be hunkered down in here working on some new projects, new information, new blog post, maybe doing some more stuff with this new YouTube channel that I've started called Hardy on History. I think Miss Elizabeth is going to try and share that link in the description, in the comments for tonight. But thank you so much for joining me here this evening and to chat just a little bit of history. A couple of maybe not so good notes. I saw a note floating around that maybe Civil War Times Illustrated has gone under. It was owned by HistoryNet and was the oldest glossy mag Civil War publication out there. It was originally started in the 1960s during the centennial. And if that information is true, that is kind of sad. I also have heard more locally to me that our county library just below me in McDowell County has closed their North Carolina Civil War or North Carolina local history section and has given away all of the books out of it. So I hope that's not true either, but that's sure the way that things are kind of sad. And then for our folks in Florida, this weekend was the last weekend for the old Townsend's Plantation Renegers reenactment. That reenactment started about 1983, 1982, 1983. And with the loss of the Narcoossee event coming up, the last one will be in March this year, they don't have any Civil War reenactments in greater Orlando area. And so we've taken several blows history wise over the past week. So, like I usually say, I encourage you to get out, keep researching, keep reading, keep sharing history, because we are the folks that do that. We're going to go ahead and get cranking this evening. Many of you know that I've been on this Memphis kick lately with my old blog, Looking for the Confederate War. And we're going to do this one live, and we will post it again either tonight or in the morning. And my interest is, we started this on Sunday Night History Chat a while back when I read from Robert Morgan's autobiography. He was the pilot of the Memphis Belle, and he talked about going to Memphis and just standing in the shadows as people walked by the Memphis Belle, which was a World War II B-17 bomber, and watching the people enjoy history and watching history. And of course, Memphis doesn't value its history. The Memphis Belle is gone. They've renamed streets. They've dug up people and moved them to other places. They've changed the name of parks. So I've been doing something about it. I don't just preach to y'all to get out and do something. I'm doing something about it. And so back on November 30th, I started posting on Looking for the Confederate War about Memphis and its history. And I think this is post number 5, or will be post number 5. We're going to talk for a few minutes this evening about Memphis's Irving Block Prison. This prison, it didn't start out as a prison. It actually was a hotel. It was a hotel that was constructed in 1860, and it had, get my image up there. And this is if the handwriting on this image is true, this image is from May of 1864, and that is the Irving Block Hotel, or Irving Hotel there. A 1939 guide to Tennessee, the WPA guide, said that this section of town was notably tough, and iron slates were used to cover the windows. When the war came, the building was used as one of the Confederate hospitals, and it was run by the Southern Mothers. When the Confederates abandoned Memphis in mid-1862, thank you, Braxton Bragg, federal officials repurposed the building as a prison for Confederate and federal soldiers, along with civilians and spies. Absalom Grimes was one of the men imprisoned at Irving Block. He was a riverboat pilot who was selected by Sterling B. Price to carry or smuggle the mail between the South and the North. Grimes was captured numerous times, including once in Memphis. After being interrogated by the provost marshal, Grimes was taken to the Irving Block prison. He wrote after the war, quote, "That prison was on the west side of Jackson Square in Memphis, 3 stories high. A pair of stairs led from the lower storeroom into the basement, where there was an excavated doorway leading into the yard. When I was placed in the cellar, a ball with a chain about 3 foot long was riveted to my right ankle, and one end of the chain was stapled to the floor. There were 18 other prisoners chained to the floor in a like manner, placed in a row from the front to the rear of the long cellar. I was chained next to the big stove." Grimes writes about a federal soldier also being imprisoned with him on that row. This particular federal soldier had got caught stealing government mules and selling them. And so he was locked up there as well. Grimes was held in this cellar for about 2 weeks. And he writes, quote, "My daily fare consisted of 2 stale crackers and a piece of rotten bacon and some water or coffee made of beans and dried Cherokee rose leaves." Adjoining the room to where Grimes was held was a room for female prisoners. Grimes was eventually transferred to Alton, Illinois, and once again escaped. His story is fascinating. Some of those female prisoners could have been prostitutes arrested in a raid in mid-1863. This house of ill repute was at 115 Bale Street. If you get on, I'm not sure if numbers have changed to Beale Street, 115 Beale Street. I'm not so sure numbers have changed on that street, but I looked it up on Google Maps, and that is actually where the Elvis Presley Plaza is today, if those street numbers still work. This particular business establishment, the lady who ran it was Kate Stoner. They arrested 6 or 7 girls and locked them up in Irving Block prison until they could all be tried. And of course, all were found guilty and sent north, someplace north, any place north of Cairo, Illinois, with a promise of imprisonment if they returned to Memphis. Interestingly enough, in the account that I read, I couldn't find any of the men being tried who were also caught in this particular establishment. Maybe we need a little bit more research on that, or maybe they got off. Another woman arrested was a lady by the name of Pullen. An officer on picket suspected her of being a smuggler and sent her back to the city, where she and probably her son were also locked up in the Irving Block prison. Colonel R.F. Looney and Captain A.D. Bright were sent by General Chambers into West Tennessee to arrest and bring back Confederates, deserters, and stragglers. These men were Confederate officers, and they were sent into West Tennessee to arrest Confederate stragglers and deserters. They were captured near Arlington, Tennessee, and sent to Memphis and locked up in Irving Block prison. One of them wrote, quote, "They were placed in a back room and strongly guarded, but in a short time the officer ordered that they be moved to the third story, a dirty place where thieves and thugs and cutthroats were kept and where vermin abounded. There was not a bed of any description in the long room, neither was there a chair or a bench to sit on. They walked the floor all night." Eventually, it appears that these men were paroled. In another instance, Lieutenant Jason Hoey, 17th Arkansas, wrote to the Secretary of War that Lieutenant Colonel Woods had bribed a federal officer, Lieutenant Dennis Lewis, to allow him to escape. After effecting his escape, Lewis had Woods caught and arrested. Woods complained that Lewis did not act the gentleman with him. He had given Lieutenant Lewis his money, and that Lewis had betrayed him. Lewis went to the prison, was shown into the cell where Woods was sleeping, and finding Woods there, Lewis drew his pistol and shot Colonel Woods in the head, killing him. According to Hoey, Lewis was tried by a court-martial, but, quote, "went to parts unknown." I found another account that said that he was supposedly tried and convicted of the crime, but escaped. The Memphis Bulletin, another story, in November 1863, related how it had been so cold and fuel or wood or coal in so short of supply that some of the prisoners tore up 50 bunks to burn and to keep warm. There were some successful escapes. Captain M.A. Miller was caught smuggling 2 boxes of cavalry swords across the Mississippi River. He was tried by courts-martial, found guilty, and condemned to death. At this early date, this is 1862, prisoners from the city were allowed to visit their homes with a guard. And under the pretext of having a sick child, and apparently the child was sick, Miller was able to escape. It's actually a fascinating story. He showed up at his house. His wife said, "Can he take a bath?" And the guard said yes. And so Miller went into a room with a bathtub, stripped off his dirty clothes, put on civilian clothes, and walked out of another door and escaped. This was all arranged because prisoners were allowed to have food from the outside. Miller actually wrote that the prison fare was unfit to eat. There were reports of some 60 or more who escaped in February of 1864 and 11 in May of 1864. U.S. General Grant had appointed Major General Stephen A. Hurlbut as commander in Memphis. While the Irving Block prison had various commanders, Hurlbut would appoint Captain George A. Williams as commandant of the prison in 1863. In April of 1864, Lieutenant Colonel John F. March, 24th Veteran Reserve Corps, U.S. Army, was sent to inspect the prison. March stated that the Irving Block prison, quote, "was the filthiest place the inspector ever saw occupied by human beings. The whole management and government of the prison could not be worse. Discipline and order are unknown, food sufficient but badly served. In a dark, wet cellar, I found 28 prisoners chained to a wet floor where they had been constantly confined, many of them for months, one since November 16, 1863, and are not for a moment released, even to relieve the calls of nature. The prison hospital had a shiftless appearance, and the guard was dirty and inefficient. There was no book of memorandum showing the disposition of the prison fund. Charges were drawn up and Williams arrested. He argued that he had done much to improve the prison. And he was a friend and a classmate of U.S. Grant. That didn't hurt his cause one bit. It did come out that Hurlbut and maybe Williams, probably Williams, were running a multifaceted extortion ring in Memphis. For example, they demanded ransoms from local wealthy families for the release of prisoners. Hurlbut also engaged in profiteering, getting cuts from cotton that moved through the city. Hurlbut also targeted the Jewish population of Memphis, closing their businesses but leaving non Jewish businesses open. Hurlbut was brought up on charges toward the end of the war, but was allowed to resign. History says, you'll find this in a couple of different places, that Lincoln ordered the prison closed in 1865. However, that does not appear to be true. In March of 1865, Colonel John P.C. Shanks, commanding a cavalry brigade in West Tennessee, made mention of capturing 2 guerrillas, Confederate soldiers, and sending them to Irving Block Prison. And then there is the fascinating story of John G. Ryan. He had already surrendered and was on parole and was passing through Memphis in July of 1865 when he was arrested and hauled by the provost to Irving Block Prison. Ryan described the third floor room he was taken to as having shackles, manacles, handcuffs, and ball and chains. A ball and chain was affixed to his left ankle. He was then removed to another room and chained to the floor. And he writes, by being chained to the floor, they took his 3-foot section of chain and a very large staple, and a man with a big sledgehammer stapled him, that chain, to the floor. Several days later, Ryan was sent to Washington, D.C. He had no idea why. He was almost mobbed as they moved through the area, and eventually somebody shoved a newspaper in front of his face. The newspaper said that he was believed to be John H. Surratt, a spy accused of plotting with John Wilkes Booth to kidnap and assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Ryan was not released until October 1865. Remember, he was arrested in July, and he later sued the government for false arrest. The building was demolished in 1937. So I am sharing all of this for the reason being that there is just not a lot of information on the Irving Block Prison. I went over there and pulled one of my books off of the shelf, the Portals to Hell, which is the standard book on Civil War prisons, Northern and Southern during the war, and there's not really a entry for the Irving Block Prison. If you go to Wikipedia, not always a good valid source, but that's where a lot of people wind up. You'll find about 5 paragraphs, very small paragraphs, that deal with the prison. And then this picture that I shared with you earlier comes from Historic Memphis, their website, talking about the prison. Kind of looks like this. As you can see, it is hard to read, very small, not very much information there. And the pictures come out, for the most part, fairly small. That one came out fairly large. So just not a lot of information out there on this source. It's really, some of this stuff is fascinating information. You know, the whole story about Ryan I had never encountered before, and his descriptions of the prison I found just absolutely fascinating. So I am probably really close to being sure that most of you have probably never heard of Irving Block Prison in Memphis. So maybe now, and you can check out the rest of the post. And and maybe learn some more of that. Jason wants to know, did Irving Block Prison allow Confederates to roam downtown Memphis saloons and brothels like Camp Davis? I didn't find reference to anybody roaming around. That could be true. Once again, there's not a lot of information on this subject. I am primarily looking at a couple of memoirs, a couple of stories in the official records, and newspaper articles. And so there's not a lot. When I mentioned the story of the Confederate officer who escaped, he was actually allowed to go with a guard to his house. And he effected his escape. It was quite an elaborate plan. They had people waiting for him at different points where he could get a wagon or a change of clothes or something. Just a fascinating story out there. But Jason, we need a lot more information out about these places. And I've said all along that I never really intend to write a book about Memphis and the war. But I'll be honest, the story about the prison, you could probably almost write a book just about the prison. Now, on FamilySearch.com, there are some one of the prison books, and I looked through some of that. It's like 245 pages of handwritten material. So I did not go through all of that. That's a week's worth of work. I would really, and that was for Confederates. I would really like to know if there is a book about civilians, a roster or an entry book for civilians and for federal soldiers as well. I would really like to know that. Well, Brian, since the Irving Block Prison was torn down in 1937, I don't think that's the same place. Randy wants to know, have you heard anything about prisoner of war camps in Bristol, Tennessee? That's a fantastic question. Of course, Bristol was under Confederate control for most of the war. I think Wes actually lives up there. Maybe he can drop a note, or I can try and look that up later, Randy. And I hope you're doing well this evening. I'll have to look. Of course, my source is the book Portals to Hell by Spear. That's the go-to book for me when it comes to northern and southern prison camps. So we'll just have there. It actually is a book on Bristol and the war. I don't think it is a noted book. Not being offensive to anyone, but I don't believe that book has notes. I also have that book over there on my shelf. Can't remember the name of it. Might have to get Miss Elizabeth over there to look on the shelf. It's a hardback book, 6x9. It's over there behind that flag on that box someplace, maybe just to the right of that. No, Portals of Hell. I look for a book about Bristol in the war.
Sorry, I'm behind listening.
That's okay. Elizabeth listens in, and she gets to hear me in like three different dimensions, live and on the phone and other places. So the Bristol book is by Bud Phillips, Between the States, Bristol, Tennessee, Virginia during the war. But it has no notes, which is unfortunate. Randy, does it mention prisons? I don't see that, Randy, in the index. We will just have to do some more research and maybe have another Sunday night live about Bristol, Tennessee, and maybe a blog post or three about Bristol, Tennessee. I'm not so sure how well Bristol is covered on the interweb there. David Pope, it is called Between the States, Bristol, Tennessee during the Civil War by Bud Phillips. Wes says that Bud's book talks a little bit about them. If I have read this book, it has been a long time. Actually, I just turned to a chapter called Civil War Prisons in Bristol. So I promise I won't read this to you. Um, I've probably already bored you enough with my reading this evening, but that's okay. So, Jason, so there were some soldiers from Andersonville moved to a camp near Middlesville, Georgia, and then some of them were moved to a camp near in South Carolina, near Florence, South Carolina. We'll just I'll have to maybe that'll roll around here in just a minute and I can help you out with that. But let me encourage you to check out Portals to Hell by Spear. It is a really good book, one of the standard books on the war, and we will have to look and um, check on that. Let me encourage you to check on that. I do prisons. Is that something you find interesting? Of course, the stories are absolutely tragic, um, and the way that we treated each other. Of course, probably the two most famous are Andersonville in the south and Elmira in the north. Um, but you know, is that something that really interests you? I have written several blog posts about prisons. I wrote one about chaplains, Confederate chaplains visiting prisoners. You can check all of this out on Looking for the Confederate War. I wrote another post about the guards that were used in the South to funnel federal prisoners back and forth across. If you were captured at the Wilderness and you got sent to Andersonville, I talked about the guards who were a part of the train that moved those prisoners. There's probably been a couple of others that I don't recall offhand. But if that's something that's interesting to you, um, let me encourage you to check it out. Um, so Jason has Portals to Hell. It's an overview of Confederate and Union prisons during the war, but it is one of the standard books that I look at quite a bit when I'm doing research on that particular subject. Um, so, David, I did not see anything in the index on General Early. It may take a little deeper read to discover those things. Um, I didn't see anything in the index. But like I said, I don't remember actually reading that book, but I'm sure I've read parts of it or thumbed through parts of it, and maybe we'll explore other things in the near future in there, and see what we can find on that subject. Um, so Randy, who is doing research about Sullivan County, Tennessee, were they Federals that were captured? Were they Confederate deserters that were captured? Um, I don't imagine that the prisons in Bristol were. I'm pretty certain they were not long-term structures. Maybe just holding facilities to move troops elsewhere. Of course, there are a lot of famous prison stories out there. You have stories, about the Immortal 600 there in Charleston, South Carolina, that were being used by federal officials, federal soldiers as human shields. And then later, most of those men are sent to Fort Pulaski down below Savannah, Georgia. And if you ever get a chance to visit that, it's part of the National Park System. Robert E. Lee worked on that fort. But if you ever get a chance, please go check it out. Just to walk around the outside of that fort and see the shells still sticking out of the walls is a fantastic way to spend an afternoon. Tragic, but fascinating. A lot of times we find tragic things fascinating. So I'm interested more in Irving Block. I would like to know how many men or women died while they're at Irving Block. Where were they buried? Um, who was the prison doctor, the federal prison doctor for the Confederates. That would be a fascinating story as well. So I think there is a lot of stuff to continue to explore and dig into that story. Um, Jason goes, was Irving a holdover for Confederate prisoners going to the war north? Oftentimes, yes, I have found that. In fact, the few pages of the surviving book that I looked at had that information that they were there a short amount of time and they were transferred further north, usually into Illinois, Alton, Illinois. Yes, for a lot of the Confederates. That's what I have found. The few pages that I looked through on Family Search of the microfilm prison records. But who else? Who else was there? A lot of this information was hard to come by, and hopefully it will. Even though I've shared it with you this evening, when it pops up on the blog tomorrow, please give it a like, a look, especially a share. I get shadow banned quite a bit on the stuff that I share, and please check it out and share it if you find it interesting. Same thing with these videos. If you want to share them, that's great. If you don't, that's fine too. I'm not down here. I'm down here to help folks, and that's what it's all about. So if you got any more things about prisons that you would like to share this evening, drop in the notes. Otherwise, we're going to sign off for this evening and put a few books up and maybe get this post ready to go up in the morning. Yes, Wes, that's kind of my thought, is that they are essentially just corrals. Jason Boshier, is good to see you this evening. Has almost no information on prison burial grounds. Is it much documented? No, it is really not much documented. We know about the big places there, Elmira, Camp Douglas in the north. We know about Salisbury. We know more, of course, about the federal prisons in the south than we do in the north. One of the things that have always been interested in is all of the disinterring and reinterring of Confederate and Federal soldiers after the war. I know from my research into Charlotte that there were Federals buried in 2 or 3 different places and Confederates buried in 2 or 3 different places around Charlotte, especially close to the hospitals. And then after the war is over, the Confederate dead are reinterred in Elmwood Cemetery, and the Northern dead, Federal dead, are sent to Salisbury National Prison. So that really is a book that needs to be written about how these burial crews move through these locations looking for the dead and getting them to Confederate or national cemeteries. It is, except for a few northern prisons, it is a southern story. And sometimes, from what limited stuff I've been able to dig out, there were southern crews of men, probably former Confederate soldiers, that were hired to disinter these Federal soldiers and put them in boxes and put them on a train to the National Cemetery. That's one of those things that need much more research. When I was last at the National Archives in June last year, I was trying to get more information on where both the Federal and the Confederate dead from the Battle of Plymouth are buried. Well, I know most of the Federal dead were transferred to the New Bern National Cemetery. The Confederate dead, I still don't actually know where they're buried. I have an idea. It would be under a parking lot behind Grace Episcopal Church. But I was hoping in finding the Federal correspondence related to that, that it would have some clues regarding the Confederate dead from the battle. Of course, the Confederates won that battle, one of the most decisive battles of the war, and they would have been responsible for burying not only their dead, but the Federal dead as well. And I talked to the military archivist there at the National Archives, but I never could find what I wanted. They brought out this box of papers relating to disinterment and reinterment, but it started after that process had already taken place and was much more about the upkeep of the national cemeteries. So I imagine the answer that I'm looking for lies in some federal general who had control of the department, one of his staff officers, or something. I don't know exactly. I don't even have I've got list of Confederate staff officers, got some great books on that. But I don't have list of federal staff officers. And so to find out who all of the staff of Sickles or one of the other federal generals in charge of North Carolina or the Department of the Southeast or whatever, that's a challenge. That is a challenge. But Jason, very little information out there about prison burial grounds. Very little. And that's actually a really good idea for a future post. And maybe we can dig a little bit more into that and share a little light. We talk a lot about burying soldiers on the battlefield, but not much about prisons. And maybe we should look further into that. Great question. Hope you're doing well over there in Tennessee. Jason, there are a lot of temporary prisons at various points in the war where the men would just be held for just a few days, a day, a few days, and then transferred to some other facility, someplace further away from the front lines. So it's a fascinating subject. It really is. So, folks, if you've got any more questions, please drop them in the comment box. Otherwise, we'll be signing off for this evening, and I will be back working on that aviation project for the next few days, hoping that I hear something soon about feeding the Army of Northern Virginia, which I posted, I think it was yesterday, that I turned that manuscript in 3 years ago. I'd like that one to come out, but that's okay. Brian, Brian Blankenship, there are mass graves all over the place. I never found exactly what happened to the Confederate dead from the Battle of Hanover Courthouse, Virginia. I've got great descriptions of, it's horrible to use such a term, but I've got fascinating descriptions of the Confederate dead being buried on the battlefield. Are they still there, or were they disinterred and taken to Ashland and buried? And I asked as many questions as I could and never got an answer to that question. So that's the way it goes sometimes when you research. Sometimes you write things and you don't have an answer, and 6 years later you find one. I haven't found Hanover yet. I may take another stab at Plymouth. We'll see. Might do that here in the future. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to sign off for this evening. Thank you so much for joining me. As I said last week, if you comment on this later, whether on Facebook or YouTube, you might want to try and go to michaelchardy.com and use the comment box, because I don't always come back and look at questions later on. Things are busy and there's a lot of you, and I don't always go back and check out. So with that, I will say thank you so much. Well, let me back up and let me say next Sunday night, the first Sunday night in February, Skip Smith is supposed to be joining me. He researches, he's helping a friend of ours, Tom Belton, write and produce a book on North Carolina's flags held at the North Carolina Museum of History. 95% of them are Confederate flags. There are a couple of federal flags. And he, Lord willing, is supposed to be joining me next Sunday night. And so please check that out and join me. And if you got any questions about the 26th North Carolina or Governor Vance or anything hard we can throw at Skip, please send me a note and let me let me know. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Please continue to get out there, research, talk about history, share history. It is up to us to do that. It is not being done otherwise. So, without any further ado, y'all have a fantastic end of January, 1st of February, and I look forward to seeing you next Sunday night. God bless.